Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Tuesday, May 30th meeting of the City Council's Subcommittee on Finance and Property. We are kicking off our budget season for the month of June with reviews of all of the department budgets and related city finance budgets. I would like to welcome all my colleagues, and also here with us this evening our budget analyst Jerry Perry, our finance director Brian Ailes, and our assistant finance director Amit Ajay. And we also have department heads Pauline Textera and David Gelano, who will also be hearing from this evening as well. We will be meeting throughout the month, every Thursday and many Tuesdays. And the calendar for that, I believe, is posted on the city website. Is that correct? Yeah, all the dates are posted on the city website, so they can be found there. Also, particularly different, and for us who do budget review, exciting, frankly, is that this year the city has, for the first time, a digital budget book, which is now available to all city residents. It's actually available to anyone who wants to go online to the city website. At the near the top on the left-hand side is a digital book of the budget, which includes everything that's in this big, thick written manual, plus an awful lot more information about city finances. And so without further ado, I would ask our budget analyst for the City Council, Jerry Perry, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, everyone. I come before you tonight consistent with our city charter and our city ordinances to provide my oral presentation regarding Mayor Michael Cahill's FY24 budget. As you know, the mayor presented to you last Thursday night his budget. A few hours later, I forwarded to you electronically my report on my opinions and recommendations and findings that you, I'm sure, spent the entire weekend reviewing, along with Mr. Ailes and Mr. Chaney's new electronic version, which my compliments to both of them for the hard work they did. But I come before you consistent with the charter and the ordinances to give you my thoughts, my opinions, and to and work with you through the budgetary process. That said, probably the most important thing that this position as your budget and management analyst does is to review the work of the administration to make a determination whether, in fact, in my opinion, it's a balance, whether or not it's a balanced budget. And it is my pleasure to report to you that, in my opinion, the budget as proposed by Mayor Cahill is in balance and would receive a tax rate certification at the end of the year if you were to pass it as is. Having said that, a few thoughts about my review and some pretty consistent with some of the things I said to you in my report. Under the laws of Proposition 2.5, the administration is going up 2.5%. This is consistent with some of my thoughts I shared with you a few weeks ago when we were talking about debt-related matters with the Cabot Street project. The 2.5% is going to go up a little over $3 million. They're still going to have about almost $1.4 million in excess levy capacity. They're not using that this year, but they could, or with your approval, but they do not plan on doing that. They are using new growth at $1,150,000, a little bit higher than other years, but still within a comfortable level that at least I'm comfortable with in terms of new growth. Looking at the history of it, I know Councilor Sweeney was working with Mr. Ailes on that a little bit. You can see some history in that. We have that, I believe, on your website too. So I'm comfortable with the utilization of the new growth figure. They are also proposing $500,000 for overlay. Now that's an interesting thing, a little bit less than other years. I am comfortable we have enough overlay to handle our abatements, if you will. That's what overlay is pretty much used for, as well as I know they're a little more aggressive with the push of the council president to deal with some senior citizen tax write-off stuff. So I'm pretty comfortable, but I'm hoping in the next 6 months or so to work with our finance director and our assessors to have a conversation about how we value utility matters, and we're going to have to make sure we have enough, depending on what direction we go, to make sure our overlay is enough. But that said, I'm comfortable with the overlay. With regard to local receipts, that's things like motor vehicle excise, rooms, meals, miscellaneous, et cetera. The administration, consistent with prior years, as well as being consistent with our financial forecast report that we did under the leadership of Council Feldman, has used a bit of a conservative approach, which I agree with totally. It will help us to have a strong balance sheet a year and a half from now, and I'm comfortable. They estimate about $12 million, and I think that works from my perspective. Finally, with regard to the local aid, they're using the House version of local aid. It's $22,360,508. The most of it is Chapter 70, which is a little over $14 million. We didn't get as much Chapter 70 this year as we did in the current fiscal year, FY23, so we were not able to expand some of our services, but the bottom line to it is all those revenues in the aggregate amount to $157,526, $157,526,500. You would think your budget analyst could read a number here, but so I'm comfortable with the revenues. With regard to expenditures, it is the expectation consistent with those revenues that the mayor is proposing you to spend the $157,526,500. Now, some of the highlights of the expenditures, obviously the big one is the schools. The schools are looking for a 4.77% increase, or a total of $72.6 million. It's an additional $3.3 million from the current fiscal year, and is pretty consistent with prior proposals from the administration. The administration holds the Beverly Public School in high regard and is a high priority, as has past and present members of the City Council, and that's why you see that amount. Augmenting the school department's budget, though, there's approximately $6.5 million revolving funds. They anticipate using $2.7 million in grants, mostly those ESSER funds. We've all heard about that in the past. And then, based on their own calculations, which every department has, there's direct and indirect costs. The services of the finance director comes in. We have the human resource people, the procurement. Everybody helps out there. But they look at direct and indirect costs to the tune of approximately $15 million to also help run the Beverly Public School System. At least half of that is the debt that we have to pay for the middle school, high school, and other things there. So with regard to that, that's the school budget. Probably one of the biggest challenges we're seeing in FY23 is healthcare costs. As you know, the City of Beverly is self-insured. When I first got here 6+ years ago, this is my 7th budget now, that was the first thing that scared me a little bit, because self-insurance in other communities has had a lot of problems, actually. But for all these years, it's never been a problem here. It's worked out well. The finance director stays on top of it. He has outside consultants to work with him, and we've been pretty fortunate. We haven't seen large increases. However, we hit the wall this year, in my view. With regard to the health care, the school alone had to go up $1,775,000 just in the school department alone. And with regard to the municipal side, it was more than $400,000. I think Mr. Ailes is going to get up sometime during your budget hearings to give you a more detailed explanation of what they went through. They raised some services on the health care, but they also were able to reduce some on some senior health care issues. But I'll defer to Mr. Ailes when the times come. But health care really was a large component of what happened to the budget, and really had a huge impact on the whole situation. One of the other challenges we saw in the budget is our vocational education report. They needed an additional $587,000, or a 25.7% increase in vocational education. I had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Manzo today about this, and got a little more detail. As you know, maybe from our financial forecast work, they anticipate I believe up to 170 students, or another 30 students for the upcoming fiscal year. And on top of it, which I didn't know until today, which I will report to you, and maybe Mr. Manzo may be coming with us when we get to it, but they're anticipating an additional 30 more students for FY25. So we're talking another 25% next year for vocational education. So we have to have, I think, a conversation with where the students coming from. Can we, obviously we have to try to afford these things. Do we need caps? I mean, that's not for this year, but the city council needs to be aware of the fact that vocational education is getting a little bit more expensive in the city and certainly adds to the overall educational cost for the students for the city of Beverly. On a smaller note, I think you'll find, and I'm sure Chief Lalach will explain to you, and the mayor told you, there's another police officer they'd like to add on board on the municipal side. You will see, and I will, with the permission of the chairman, get up and speak a little bit about the Veterans Office. They're going to add either an administrative assistant slash budget benefit coordinator at that department. We'll get into that. And there are some additional assistant harbor masters that you may want to talk a little bit about when we get to that budget. In terms of the debt actually dropped this year. You heard the mayor talk a little bit about this, but what the administration has done because of the dip in the debt, consistent with our capital expenditure report, they're backfilling that with a fire truck. The mayor talked about this last Thursday night. I wholeheartedly support that. I think it's a very wise decision. The purpose of it to try to keep the debt a little bit, not dipping up and down, but try to keep it somewhat steady. So they're going to backfill. I think the truck is about $850,000. We'll talk about that with the fire chief, but I think the administration should be commended. It was a wise decision. I will say, going back a little bit on healthcare, we have new revenue of about $6.9 million in new revenue across the board, of which $2,254,000 and change are healthcare related, or 32.7% of all our new revenue is going to healthcare in FY24. So again, you can see the challenge that healthcare has kind of been thrust upon the administration to try to come up with a balanced budget. And it's an area that obviously we have to do with our benefits, but something you should be certainly cognizant about. In terms of the overall general fund, in my view, it's pretty much a level-funded budget. We have a few additions, a police officer. I think it's 3 FTEs at the school department and a half person at the veteran, but certainly nothing like we had last year. Last year we added almost 26 FTEs. I think it was 21 and a half in the schools and the rest on the municipal side. This year is nothing like that, but it's because of healthcare costs. It's probably the biggest contributing factor, and it's something, again, you should be aware of. So they're not really looking to expand the services too much, both on the school side and the municipal side this year with this budget, with some minor exceptions.
Mr. Perry,
Yes, sir.
just a quick note, FTEs for those who are watching
My apologies,
online.
you caught me that the last time. Full-time employees, you are correct. It's, in other words, one person. So if you say 1.5, it's 1.5 employees. So
Thank you.
thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. With regard to the enterprise funds on the water and sewer rates, the current water rate is $3.28 per 100 cubic feet. They are proposing to go up to $3.40 per 100 cubic feet in FY24. The sewer rates are currently $6.24 per 100 cubic feet, and they are proposing to go up to $6.40 per 100 cubic feet on the sewer. So the combined FY23 water sewer rate is $9.52 per 100 cubic feet. They want to go to $9.80. I think it's about a 2.9% increase in your water and sewer rates. And again, something you want to be aware of and maybe talk about when Commissioner Collins comes on board to talk to you a little bit. Within the enterprise funds, several of them are proposing transfers from what is known as retained earnings. That's, as you all know, but for the folks at home, retained earnings are similar to free cash. It's certified by the Department of Revenue. It's money left in the budget that could be used for those purposes. I reviewed all the retained earnings and all the transfers that Mr. Ailes has suggested, and we have sufficient funds, and I'm comfortable that we can, no problems in that area. The sanitation is $3.7 million and change. It's contractually agreed upon. It went up quite a bit last year. It went up a little bit more this year, but I should advise you that the general fund, the taxpayers, subsidize the sanitation account by $2,260,000, or 60.9% of the entire enterprise fund is paid for by the taxpayers. So we subsidize that also with user fees, as you know, and they also looking for a transfer of retained earnings of $99,000 and change, which there is sufficient funds. The only comment I made about that is that it's certainly fine the way they're doing it. We have not, from my observations, increased the trash user fees in many, I don't think it's ever been done since I've been here. It's an option, obviously the mayor has to submit it, but each and every year, and I know it's not politically popular, but at the same token, you have to understand as councilors, it's costing the taxpayers more to cover the sanitation. Either the taxpayers do it or the ratepayers cover it, and that's something that you should at least be privy to. The rest of the enterprise funds are pretty good. Again, they are balanced in my opinion. With the chairman's permission or the council president's position, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about the airport enterprise fund this year. When you get to that, that's something I'd like to have a conversation with you when the time comes. So bottom line, you have a balanced budget. I have no problem if you were to pass this budget. It is balanced in nature. To refresh your memory, as you all know, you can cut any budget you want, but you unfortunately cannot raise a budget, nor can you take money from Part A and put it in Part B. You can't do that. All you can do is reduce a budget by state law. So the bottom line to it all, Mr. Chairman and members of the council, it's a balanced budget. Be comfortable with that. There are sufficient revenues to match expenditures. And I plan, Mr. Chairman, of being here with each and every one of your meetings for the month of June, as we do traditionally. And I stand ready to answer any questions, to assist all of you in any manner you deem appropriate. That said, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my commentary. I don't know if there's questions, or we can do that at another time.
So I will say this is a meeting of the Subcommittee of Finance and Property, but as is common and appropriate for a budget review, all members of the council, even though they are not members of the subcommittee, will have an opportunity to ask questions of any department head or anyone else who speaks for us at these budget hearings. So, but we will start with members of the Finance and Property Subcommittee if you have any questions for Mr. Perry. Councilor St. Hilaire.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Mr. Perry. I did spend some time looking at this over the weekend, and it was very detailed and very helpful. Together with the tools that the administration has provided, I think we're in a good position over the next couple of weeks to dig in. I guess my first reaction overall is regarding roads and sidewalks and a $600,000 cut to what we spent or budgeted last year. And I guess in thinking about that, I'm looking at your memo regarding revenues, and one of the bullet points here was regarding request transfer from certified retained earnings to augment the enterprise funds. Could you talk a little bit about that? It looked like over $1.5 million to the water, sewer, recreation, senior citizens, and sanitation funds. What is that money, or I guess, could you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure, by all means. It's a great question, Councilor. So there are two ways we have, there's several ways we have reserves, but two ways is our free cash proposal, which you obviously are familiar, and the second is retained earnings. Now, free cash is a certification off the balance sheet for general fund revenues. So this current year, we had a certification of about $9.9 million. So we have that over here. On the retained earnings, it's the same thing as free cash, except for it involves the enterprise funds. Water, sewer, sanitation, recreation. We have quite a few. I think we have more in this city than almost any place else from my airport, senior citizen golf and tennis, recreation as well. So what happens is each and every year when Mr. Ailes and his assistant finance director, Mr. Chaney, close the books, we have a reconciliation and it goes onto the balance sheet. And it's a lot more complicated than this, but simply put, it's when you take the revenues, subtract the expenditures, there's deferred revenue, there's deficits and things of that nature. Bottom line is how much money, simply put, is left over in those accounts. And what that is called is either free cash in the general fund or in the enterprise fund known as retained earnings. It traditionally gets certified each fall, around November, December, the time frame that our finance director works on that. And then if you have X amount of dollars in retained earnings, the administration, the mayor can come before the city council and say, I want to take some of those retained earnings, money left over from the prior fiscal year, and use it, if they so desire, to help augment revenues for next year's budget. It could do it for a whole bunch of things. We spend money on a whole host of things, as you know, including things like stabilization fund and OPIP. So the bottom line to it is the administration, and they have historically This is my 7th budget. Every year I've been here, they've used some of that to help with the enterprise funds. They take some of that retained earnings as a revenue source in each and every enterprise fund to make sure it's balanced. And that's pretty much, hopefully, I'm hoping that answers your question with regard to retained earnings.
Go ahead.
And what can that be used for? Can that only be used for those enterprise funds?
Yes. The general fund could be used for anything, including, believe it or not, enterprise funds. But the money with regard to each individual enterprise fund can only be used for the specific enterprise fund itself.
Okay.
Good question.
Go ahead. Just to follow up, there's a further recommendation that 2.2 million from general fund revenues subsidize the sanitation enterprise budget.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about
Sure.
what that transfer is all about?
Yeah, I mentioned that in my report. I even mentioned it up here a little bit. So, bear with me if I can just get to that page so I make sure I have the numbers right. Here we go. So, in FY '24, the mayor is proposing, in order to pay for the trash removal costs under sanitation, $3,708, $3,708,000 and $588. 3.7 million, let's let it go with that, okay? So it's an increase from 3.5 million of last year. So what's happening here in the sanitation, as I indicated earlier, the way the administration is proposing to pay for the 3.7 million is they want to take $2,260,000 of general fund revenue, which is paid by the taxes, the property taxes of this community, and then they are going to add to that $99,088 of retained earnings, which we just discussed, that's been certified by the Department of Revenue. The certification in sanitation from the DOR is $171,188. And then the third component, the remainder of that number of the 3.7 minus 2.2 is to come from trash fees that we collect, I believe, quarterly. Mr. Ailes, am I correct in that? Is it quarterly? Yeah. So that's how that's where the three revenues are coming from to pay for the 3.7 million sanitation fees.
Okay, and that is general fund money that could be used technically for anything.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
That was general fund money that could be used potentially for anything.
Oh, yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's a policy decision. I suppose one could theoretically raise the sanitation fees to cover the entire 3.7, which will relieve, could give 2.2 million more dollars to go towards general fund expenditures like police, fire, schools, roads and sidewalks, whatever you want to do with it,
Or we could have taken all of the 171,000 in retained earnings rather than just the 99.
Well, that's a great question. I've talked quite a bit, Mr. Ailes and I have discussed that. You want to be a little careful. I'm an advocate for taking more of the enterprise funds than I am the general fund of free cash, but you don't want to take it all. That would be a mistake, because then what happens is you're coming to the edge of the cliff. You've got to be careful that we don't have a deficit at the end of the fiscal year. So prudent financial practice, which the finance director is utilizing in my view, is you use some of it, but you don't want to use all of it. You've got to carry forward some of the fund balance, because if you have a deficit in the enterprise fund, then next year the general fund's going to have to pick up that deficit. It's a double hit. You don't want to do that. So I'm comfortable. You could legally do it, yes, but it would not be a wise decision.
So I guess my last point, is, just to follow up, and, I am concerned that we're cutting roads and sidewalks by $600,000. And I guess my point of asking these questions is, these are decisions, right? And we could have taken more of that retained earnings, but we decided to take general fund money, and we've decided to cut paving money. And so I think, over the next few weeks, I would like to see us try to identify areas where we could put money back into roads and sidewalks, because that is the number one issue I continue to hear about from our constituents.
If
I think
I
it's
may,
important, and I think it's important we address it.
If I may, with the permission of the chairperson.
Go ahead,
we,
Mr.
we
Perry.
literally just talked about this before I
I think
got
I
up
know
here.
where you're going.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the administration is going to come before you in the next week or so. They're going to take existing free cash, and I believe what their intention is to, and I don't want to preempt them, but with Mr. Ailes' permission, it's my understanding that to make up that $600,000 difference, they're going to take it from free cash, which will come before you in a couple of weeks for your approval, and that's how they're trying to at least break even from the current fiscal year. So they are making an effort to come before you on that area. That's how they're planning on funding it this year.
Thank you.
Council President, you had a question?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Perry, and I would echo Councilor St. Hilaire's thanks to Mr. Ailes, Mr. Chiani, for the tools that you have put together for us for this budget presentation. I'm looking forward to walking through this budget using the ClearGov tool as well as our sort of traditional tools. Mr. Perry, I just had one question. I know you mentioned when you were talking about local aid, you did note this is the House version of local aid. I know we don't have like a crystal ball, but do you have a sense, or I guess Mr. Ailes, if you do, should we be at all attentive to that? How likely or unlikely do we think it is that that local aid number will shift?
No, I'm pretty confident, and I'm sure Mr. Ailes can speak to it too. I'm comfortable with the number. I've sent you some memos on the governor's budget, the Senate, the House Ways and Means. They're in conference committee. They are debating a little bit up there for my observations. I'm very confident. Mr. Ailes wants to get up and say the same thing. I'm sure he will. I'm pretty sure he's pretty confident. I wouldn't worry about that. We will get that. The only thing you may see, but I wouldn't worry about it in terms of our own revenue flows. I wouldn't be surprised if the state, House, and the governor don't get a budget till July or August, but we have enough cash flow to handle those issues. I'm very confident. I don't think the council should worry about that.
Thank you.
I just have two quick questions. One is to follow up on President Flowers' question. Don't we traditionally benchmark against the governor's proposed budget as opposed to the House budget?
No, we, for my, I know last year for certain was the House budget, and I think you've done pretty much the House, haven't you, over the years?
No, we would go typically the lowest net.
Okay. Last year you went with the House too. This year you're going with the House. I know you went with the House last year. So they went lower. That caused us some problems a few years ago, as I recall, coming back in November. But I believe I haven't got that memo in front of me. I did send it to you. Is the House, Brian, to your recollection, the lowest net? Yeah. So he's being most conservative in that area.
The lowest net number,
Yeah.
then, is.
And there wasn't a large difference between the governor, the House, and Senate for the city of Beverly. It was like, I don't know, 50, 60. I forget the number. I could dig it out for you. I've got it in my reports. But to me, it's not an issue. We're going to be comfortable. Don't worry about the local aid. We're good with that. I'm comfortable. We're going to be okay in that area.
Thank you. My second question is, a few weeks ago, the council passed an order by the mayor for an $8 million sort of package, if you will, that involved a number of different goals. And you laid out at that time, sort of globally for the next few years, a set of, I think, 5 sort of guidelines or criteria for that we really needed to be mindful of and basically follow, give or take, for the next at least 2 budget years. Does this budget, is it consistent with meeting those 5 guidelines?
Yes, I'm comfortable with it, especially in the area of local receipts. I think I commend the finance department, Mr. Ailes and Mr. Chiani, for how they did it, and I'm comfortable with that. How we spend the remainder of our free cash, as Councilor St. Hilaire indicated, we talked about how they're going to do that. We're philosophically discussing that. We're also looking at things like the year-end reports and revenues. But the bottom line to it, at this point in time, I'm very comfortable with the administration, how they're handling the budget, and it's consistent with those 6 principles I forwarded to you a month ago.
Thank you very much. Other councilors, questions for Mr. Perry at this point? You'll certainly have other occasions to ask questions as we move along. Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. I shared some of those questions. So the only other one that I wanted to ask sort of off the bat is whether you see any further impacts of the ARPA funding, so the COVID relief funding being spent down, being able to augment parts of the budget, because you mentioned we're sort of due to the impacts of largely healthcare costs and some additional staffing, really level funding or sort of just barely level funding within this budget. So just curious if you see any other opportunities.
It's interesting, Council, you mentioned that. We've had some internal controls, thanks to Chairperson Hausman. We've had some meetings with our public works friends, public services. There's been some, I've had a couple conversations today about using some short money on ARPA as it relates to some of capital expenditures. We'll talk a little bit more about that when Commissioner Collins comes in. But the one thing I want to be careful of on grants, which really ARPA is a grant, we want to be careful that we're using the money as I consider like a one-time expenditure. We don't want to make it part of the operational cost. And from my reviews of it to date anyways, the administration has not used that $12.6 million for anything but one-time expenditures, which is the smart decision. As you also know, when we approved the ARPA funds, you ceded authority to the administration to spend it as they deem appropriate. Obviously, they work with you and interact with you, and you've had a lot of input on that. But in terms of the ARPA, I think it expires another year or two. They have to spend it down, and so far they're spending it in a wise manner, in my view.
Go ahead, Counselor.
Thank you, and it may be a question for a different point in the budget process, but just if you have a sense for how much of that remains to be spent in the next fiscal year or two, where we might see some of that impact.
The ARPA money, you mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got a report. Last report I have, but I know it's old information. We had 12.6. They committed to 2.8, but Mr. Ailes would know better than I. I don't know how much, or maybe Mr. Chiani would know. Do we know how much has been spent to date on ARPA? I don't know the answer to that question, but the last one I saw was 2.8.
Mr. Ailes, if you would go to the podium, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I can give you some general response to that, but I think to be more thorough and more accurate, we may want to refer to Ms. Dalton to update her report, which she'll be doing over the next month, and present that during our budget hearings during one of those nights to give you a better sense. However, the vast majority of those funds have been set aside for particular initiatives, most notably the McPherson Youth Center project. So when we talk about utilizing those funds, every dollar you spend out of the ARPA pushes the McPherson costs out of ARPA and into either free cash or debt service, which, as Mr. Perry's points to us the other week when we were authorizing the $8 million expenditure, is something we really need to be mindful of. So once we present that in a more thorough way and you're able to see where everything is slotted, it's probably more appropriate to have a more thorough discussion at that time.
Thank you. Any other questions from councilors? If not, I'd like to avail myself of either Mr. Ailes or Mr. Chiani for the benefit of folks who may be watching at home and trying to utilize the benefits of the new digital budget book. We heard from Mr. Perry a number of sort of finance or municipal budget terminology that not everyone might be familiar with. And I wondered if you could, Mr. Ailes, just briefly talk about the structure of the digital book, so those who might want to go online and follow along with what we are doing have a sense of it. So when you and I met a few days ago, you sort of talked about how it was, you sort of go left to right, you can go into detail. And so just a sort of a global big picture overview of how this works. And for those on watching the BevCam screen, and kudos to BevCam for doing a superb job at helping coordinate the viewing public with seeing what the council is going to see from the digital book. You can actually follow along at home or after the fact with what we review by going to the digital book and seeing not only what we're discussing in general, but also if you go down to the introduction introduction tab, there is a bunch of general information, and it goes as far as granular information down to a glossary of terms. And on the budget overview tab, the second item down, the full line item budget detail, takes you to what is the, down further, the Munis budget report, which is a actual line by line itemized budget that adds up to the entire budget for the city. So with that prelude, Mr. Ailes, if you'd sort of just do a quick walkthrough for the public.
Well, I think you covered a lot of it here. I mean, there's a lot of information, as you can see on your screen now, it's effectively information that helps feed into the overall budget. And we tried to put everything in this digital budget book that could answer any possible questions. So we did hear some questions from some counselors before, for example, around the roads and sidewalks. If you were to go to the mayor's transmittal letter, here, right contained within there, it explains, how, in fact, we're going to handle the roads and sidewalks for FY24, and even though it's funded at the noted $2.1 million that will be coming before the council for some additional funding before the end of the fiscal year. Right here. And so we try to kind of put little snippets in there that help people understand what it is and why things are funded the way they are. But as a reader, as you go from the left to right, the information becomes more detailed. So when you start at the left, it's very high-level overview type information, summary level stuff, different types of charts, different types of year-over-year graphs and such. And as you get to the fund summaries and the department expenditures, it gets down into that granular level of how much we're spending on in a particular office for supplies or something else. And so within the department expenditures, it really gets into that level of detail of spending by department and what the initiatives are. It also contains in there org charts and descriptions of what the missions of those departments are and what some goals are for the coming fiscal year they hope to accomplish with their funding, the requested funding amounts.
Great, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think, so we're hearing from Pauline Texera of the Human Resources, and then David Gelino from Purchasing, and then Mr. Ailes, Finance Department, which includes the assessors, the IT department, the enterprise funds and revenues globally as well. So good evening, Ms. Texera. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
So this is a little bit different this year. We've never had this sort of digital book. We will, certainly I as chair, will learn a little bit the best way, the most effective way to sort of use this as a resource in a way that is different than we've done in the past, which is flipping through page by page of your budget and asking whatever questions we may have on a line-by-line basis.
Mm-hmm.
But traditionally, we always start with a sort of a brief introduction by you. This year, you already have sort of a written introduction and mission statement, so you don't have to speak long, but I invite you if you have any comments you'd like to share before we started into the more detailed review.
Sure. There's not a whole lot to talk about with the budget. As you can see, there are no increases, and the only decreases we have are in our overtime and part-time line. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. And for anyone who is interested, human resources is basically personnel, hiring and so forth, and the description of the function of the department is here online as well. So
Yes.
Without further ado, I ask any members of Finance and Property if you have any questions or comments for Mr. Texera. Yes, Councilor St. Hilaire.
I just had a question, Mr. Chair. I know last year during your presentation, you were talking about work that you were doing with Mr. Toppin, who was then Chief Diversity Officer. Just curious for any updates you have on HR-related initiatives related to the diversity effort.
Right, so like I put that in one of my goals on there, is to build on enhancing our recruiting process to continue hiring the most qualified and diverse candidates for the city of Beverly. And as you may know, I think I talked about it last year anyways, that we post our jobs on as many job boards as possible, as many diverse job boards as possible, and as well as social media. And we are looking forward to working with our new Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Director, Ms. Wangari Fahari, in helping us with the candidate screening process, which Mr. Toppin was taking part in, and she will be helping us out with that soon. I would like to point out one thing that Ms. Fahari helped us with recently, where we had a summer hire who a Spanish-speaking summer hire who was completing his new hire paperwork, which you all have completed when you were onboarded. And he was having difficulty with it, and typically, you could just ask someone who speaks Spanish to help us. You know, maybe if someone in the clerk's department needs someone to help with Spanish speaking, we can find someone in the building who can help. But the information that this new hire is filling out is confidential information. It's social security, date of birth. So we found ourselves in a place where we didn't know how we could help him. I reached out to Ms. Fahari, and she is getting those forms translated for the new hire. And she is privy to confidential information, so she can help him fill out his new hire paperwork. So not a problem we've ever had, but we had it, and we found a solution, and now we can put a process in place.
Thank you. And I guess if I could just follow up, I see a line item for seminars and training. Just any thoughts on how you generally use these funds, and thoughts about how you might utilize them this year?
Sure, those are specifically for the Human Resources Department, so those are seminars and trainings. Those are also memberships, publications, annual conferences, so they're kind of the typical ongoing trainings that we do each year.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Texera. My question is a follow-up to Councilor St. Hilaire's first question. I was similarly interested in an update on the work that you were doing around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which you had talked to us about. And so I know there's no increases. You mentioned that your budget really is not increased. I think last time we did talk about that with expanding job postings and thinking about ways that we might post and reach out to candidates that go beyond what we might have normally initially done in the city of Beverly to be able to make sure that we're reaching more people. You had talked about there was some cost with that. I guess my question is, do you feel that your budget, without any increases, is it able to fully support your efforts in that area and making sure that we really are reaching out to, posting to, and then adequately supporting and onboarding people as we're hiring them? Are there areas where the budget you feel can't quite meet some of those goals, or do you feel that even without an increase, it's adequately supporting those goals that you have in place?
I think it's supporting the goals that we have in place. We increased our job advertising line significantly, and we've used it all. So that's been helpful. And we also, we use social media, and that, that doesn't cost us anything. So that's been great.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilor Rotundo.
Thank you. In regards to the outreach that you're doing, have you found success reaching out to people of color with the diversity, with the advertising? Has it been successful in your opinion, or have you still not been able to get a good attraction of diversity coming into the city?
So we're gathering that information. We have an invitation to, what do we call it? Invitation to self-identify. So we're gathering that information when people apply for jobs. We have it once they're hired, but when they apply, we don't have it. So that's something new that we have in place. It's not, we've gathered it, it's not put together in whether it's going to be in Excel or what we put it in, but we're gathering that now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Councilor Rand.
Thank you. I have a question along the same lines. First, I'll echo my thanks for you, Ms. Texera, for working with the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Department or Director. And my question really sort of refers back to the FY23 budget, where you had $5,000 for advertising. And I'm curious, because we had a lot of turnover in the last fiscal year. Should we expect that it really will top out at 5,000, or are you anticipating kind of invoices trickling in for advertising? I'm just curious. I don't know if that's more for Mr. Ailes or.
Yeah. So for this year, we will use all of it. And for next year, like I said, We do have social media, which is free, so that's helpful. And we have used, so we've posted our jobs on one place that's called workplacediversity.com, and that just advertises on many diverse job boards. So we can pay one price and reach out to many different diversity job boards. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just kind of thinking about how this year showed so much turnover that I feel like if the 5,000 from FY '23 covered this year, I would imagine it would cover next year too. I mean, hopefully we're not seeing turnover at the same rate next year, but, so, yeah, that
think it
answered my question.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Other counselors? Counselor Bone.
Thank you. Just understanding that there isn't a whole lot of play in this budget, wanted to know a little bit about the plans for supporting staff in the coming year. Thinking about, preparing for renovations in City Hall and just knowing what city staff have been through in the last couple of years. We've seen turnover and want to focus on retention going forward as well. So I know some things that your team works on are funded outside of your team's budget, but from what's here and from what may be in collaboration with other departments, can you share what some of those plans are for supporting staff in the year ahead? If there are any new ways that you'll be thinking of preparing people for that move, encouraging hybrid work where it's appropriate, supporting people in whatever ways we can.
We haven't really had many conversations about the move, but in HR in general, we have been looking for benefits that we can offer employees that are out-of-the-box benefits. So we've recently, and I think you know, because in the benefit is offered to you as well, is we offered the Calm app. And if you don't know what the Calm app is, it's an app for, it's a meditation app. It has guided meditations. It has master classes, sleep stories. It'll have, different types of like nature, calming music. And we also have an employee assistance program. We have one that is more of a referral program. So if an employee wants confidential counseling, they'll call this number and they may get referred out to someone. We've added another employee assistance program where an employee can call the provider, and they meet with the provider themselves, and they stay with that provider. So it's not so much a referral system, it's more personalized. So in general, to help support our employees, those are the things that we look to do, and that's what we've just recently put in place. Along with our employee events, what was the last one that we recently had was for the Red Sox, and we try to do those things. We couldn't do, we've done Celtics Pride. We couldn't do, we can't do Celtics Pride. We've done Patriots Pride, unfortunately.
collective tear.
Feel proud
You
of
can
them,
still
right?
be proud.
Yeah, you
Yes,
still
yes, exactly.
They tried hard. They tried. Got it to Game 7.
Are there any other non-Celtics questions from the council, as we all bemoan our fate? Mr. Hales, do you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, not so much a question, but I did just want to add, I know we're focused on HR here, which is very broad, right? And I think you made a note of it because so much of what we do might fall outside the HR budget. But there were a couple questions specifically about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So it's important to note that there are other areas in the budget that fund and support those efforts, particularly within the executive department, which we'll hear from the mayor later this week, I believe it is, on that. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Mr. Hales. If we have no other questions, Mr. Xero, always a pleasure to see you when budget season rolls around and any other time we need your help. So thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Mr. Gelano, you're at bat. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you. The budget, like Pauline's, is pretty straightforward. Sad to say, there won't be much Pride Days for anything with the Celtics, Bruins, Patriots, and the Red Sox. But any questions you may have, be more than happy to answer them.
Okay. Members of the Finance and Property Subcommittee? Questions? Other members of the council, any questions for Mr. Gelano? Yes, Councilor Rand.
Thank you. I was interested in your, Mr. Gelano, and your kind of overview and setting of goals that I read in your, the digital presentation. And I just wanted to hear from you maybe more about your push to educate departments on using purchase orders and sort of what that process does for your budget or not and your use of time.
Yeah, so what that does is it sort of drives people, it's a control, right? It's a way to control cost, to keep aware. You know, we all saw recently, and I'm not accusing anything, but the MBTA problem that they had. If they had the system like we have in place, that will never happen here. So it's more than one person looking at things. It's making sure that, I always try to educate department heads that it's, sort of the old-fashioned way, but if you had a bunch of envelopes and, I'm gonna put my rent money here, my electricity here, and my cable here, well, I can't overspend them because I have the money. So once you do a requisition, it then turns into a purchase order, and that money is set aside, so you'll have the money when you sign a contract. I want to thank Amit. He was huge this year, and we got a new Munis system, the education for everybody. Going forward, everyone was prepared, and so thank you to both Brian and Amit, and it was a huge undertaking, but went through pretty flawless, and it's just a tribute to the good group of people that we have here.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like you accomplished a lot. I think putting a manual in people's hands is a huge tool to support a department head using the system you want them to use is huge, so.
We're all in a hurry to get things done, and sometimes from the outside, it looks like government moves very slow, but there's a lot of moving parts, and we're a business that's open 24/7, and so even on the weekends when we're closed, things are happening, and the procurement manual kind of helps to sort of educate people. I'm in a hurry, I need this part, I need that, I got to get going, and it sort of lets them see the, not struggles, but the process we have to go through. And sometimes it takes longer than we want it to take, but there's reasons for it. And at the end of the day, we're here to help everybody and get the job done, and I think we all do pretty good at it.
Thank you.
Councilor Bowen.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions related to the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals for the department. So the first one is just if you had any highlights that you wanted to share about action that's happened over the last year or plans coming up.
Yeah, so recently I've just started giving Wangari copies of all the bids, so we hope going forward. I always try to educate people. I've worked with a couple of companies to try to get them on state contract, to try to help them. That's sort of a cumbersome process. And then guide them, we're required by law to post things like Goods and Services Bulletin, the Central Register, Combis. Those are all free. But every 351 cities and towns by law have to put their bids there. And so instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, I try to educate people to say, go to those sites, and that's where you'll find the advertisements. For us, we also advertise in the Salem News, we put it outside the clerk's office, and whenever we do the bids, we put them on our website.
Go ahead.
And just to follow up, I know a few other communities have been working with similar recommendations to what we received a couple of years back with the race equity audit. So I saw Brookline and Somerville launched a study to look at disparities in procurement, and whether that could be a basis for action. And then mayors from Boston, Lynn, Somerville, Cambridge, and Salem signed on to a commitment to a specific DEI evaluation criteria. So with those kind of things happening in the field, are we considering policies like that here, or research towards action steps like that?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a better question for the mayor. I mean, I don't make policies. That's probably a question for the mayor's office, and
Yeah, just to follow up on Counselor Bowen's questions, not knowing a whole lot about procurement, maybe I'd benefit by reading the manual. So Ms. Textera talked about going to specific different sites, specifically online, to reach sort of a different audience that we might traditionally have not reached in the past. I'm not sure I'm clear from your answer. In the world of procurement, I would imagine that there are also different specific sites that maybe have not been utilized in the past that could be used in the future to try to expand DEI goals in the world of procurement, so that you reach different audiences who might not necessarily think, as you put it, to come to us. We're sort of reaching out to them. Does that paradigm fit in the world of procurement? I mean, it seems like it would, but.
yeah, I haven't, I'm pretty close with a lot of my colleagues, and I haven't heard of any websites that are specifically for, the diversity type of advertising. The state has a Samba website, which there are companies listed on that website that are minorities and diverse companies. But I don't know of any specific that are advertising for invitations for bids or RFPs.
Okay, all right, thank you. Any other questions from the council for Mr. Gelano? Seeing none, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to see you, Mr. Gelano.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Appreciate
Okay.
it. It is now 7:30, and we, as committee of the whole, which we convened at 6:30, and along with the subcommittee, we need to set a public hearing for 6:30 on, do I have this right, Council President, June 13th, Tuesday?
Yes, you have that correct.
Yes. So I would, for the subcommittee, entertain a motion to set a, and then we'll go to the full council.
Yes,
is that correct?
yes, or you can do either way. Yes, or you can take,
Can we just go straight to the full council?
if you wish to do that, you could go to committee of the
Why
whole.
don't we just go to the committee of the whole altogether and start with that? And I would entertain a motion to set a public hearing on the budget for Tuesday, June 13th at 6:30 PM here in council chambers at City Hall. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, Mr. Ailes. Good evening.
Good evening.
You have a very broad scope of oversight within finance, and am I correct that, or maybe I should ask the question, is my list complete? That is the finance department, the assessors department, the IT department, as well as oversight of all the enterprise revenues. Is that a complete list, or are there other wheelhouses you are in charge of?
Assessors, IT, accounting. We heard from procurement, and there's also the Treasury Collector's Office.
Okay.
I know you've got enterprise listed here. It looks, based on the schedule, Mr. Chair, that most of the, actually all the enterprise funds are listed on the Mike Collins evening, June 6th, if I'm reading the right schedule. So maybe those would be better served with him present. those discussions.
With Mr. Collins?
Yeah, well, he's involved in most of them. I mean, there's still the
Sure.
golf and tennis and airport and recreation and stuff that are some other department heads are involved with, but
Okay.
for the
So
most
you'd
part.
recommend that we take those on a department by department basis for the enterprise funds?
Yeah, that would be my recommendation if
Okay.
you're okay with it. Yeah.
All right. I believe you're familiar with the digital budget book,
A little bit.
having put it together. Is there anything in general you'd like to say before we sort of jump straight to questions from the council?
No, we can just jump right in.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right. With that, members, I'll start out actually with one question. It's sort of fairly granular, and that is the IT department. Could you just sort of bring us up to date on the developments in the IT department for the last couple of years? There's been an awful lot of improvement and development just in the physical space, but from a budgetary point of view as well, and just capacity, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a department that that a lot of other departments rely on as a central service and central support type department. I guess to answer that question, I would back up a few years to just about right before the pandemic, when we were rolling out new email platforms, new website, and then the pandemic hit, and we had to shift gears, and the team downstairs, I can't say enough good things about how quickly they were able to react. We were well ahead of the curve of many other communities in terms of our ability to go remote, in terms of continuing to process things, continuing to receive revenue, continuing to process payroll, all the important things that we do kind of behind the scenes that people don't really get too jazzed up about, but the clock needs to keep ticking. And they were able to, on a dime, switch our operations remotely. And a lot of the department heads helped out with that too, because there were changes to processes that needed to take place as well. There was a significant amount of investment made during that time to enhance, with our remote capabilities, our security levels, our duplication, I guess, is the right word, of kind of the redundancy of our network, and making sure that we would always be able to operate. We also invested significantly in a significant amount of infrastructure in terms of switches, servers, laptops, desktops, all the things that are needed to continue to run. So now we have a regular process of replenishment of those types of hardware equipments. In addition to that, because we were operating remote, we realized there were some business enhancements we could implement, which required additional investments in software and support on that front. More recently, they've been involved in implementing the citywide, I'm going to get this terminology wrong. It's Central Square, which is a enterprise system software suite which touches all of our departments and acts as a central repository for asset management, as well as permitting and processing within departments. And so that is contained in this budget here. They've also helped to support the migration to the new Munis platform over this past spring, which was a significant lift because our entire accounting system effectively got a facelift and got kind of the chairs moved around a little bit in some areas. And through that, we recognized a lot of opportunities as well to kind of review our policies, procedures. Mr. Chayani was helpful in a lot of some of the best practices that he's seen in his experience, and beginning to roll that into the migration process. You may recall, about a year and a half ago, I would say, we increased their staff capacity by 1, with the goal of having a greater focus on end user support. And that's beginning to play out because they're available in many different ways, depending upon how someone is working, whether that's getting out on site to look at their hardware equipment or remotely. They're able to very quickly basically help the end users. And that's also freed up some capacity to contribute to some of these larger initiatives, like the enterprise software system, like the Munis upgrade, like certain training coordinations that needed to take place over the last year. I could go on, but that's just a general kind of
that's
oversight.
helpful.
The budget has grown over the last few years to help support that, but we think it's more appropriately aligned with what the industry standard is in terms of IT spending for a budget of $157 million and roughly 1,000 plus employees across the schools in the city.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if Mr. Chiani could bring up the expenditures by function, either as a pie chart or a bar chart. By function, expenditures by function. Maybe it's further down.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
It's by type.
You're already into IT, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just looking at finance generally. That's to give an overview of the finance department itself in terms of the respective. There we go.
Sure.
That's what I was thinking of. Thank you. Yeah. So this just helps us get a sense of the respective allocation of the finance department's budget and responsibilities.
I would just point out one thing with this chart, and sometimes, we're trying to kind of simplify things and present it in a simplified manner, but you lose some of the kind of nuances. If someone were to look at this, they would say, wow, the accounting department takes up 41% of the finances budget. But what is included in the accounting budget is about $1 million in premiums for citywide insurance policies. That's casualty and property insurance, which is included in the accounting budget. So if you were to strip that out, you would see the pie look very much more like kind of equal slices.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
No.
Members of the council, questions for Mr. Ailes? Go ahead, Mr. St. Hilaire.
I had a few questions regarding the assessor's office. I know there's been some changes there that I see reflected in the budget. Could you just walk us through again some of those changes? And, for instance, the department head has been zeroed out, it looks like, and a lot more focus on the part-time assessor and also the capital outlay, the revaluation, what is that expense? And just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Mr. Chiani, could you go up, please, to the pie chart? Maybe we'll start there. I'm sorry, the org chart, and we can start there. Yeah, perfect. So this past year, we had our former chief assessor and head of the department resign. And so we took that as an opportunity to really assess the skill sets that exist within the department and try to structure a department that can be most efficient. And what we decided was the appropriate course forward was to have all of the day-to-day office functions flow through the assessor, which, as you all may know, is Terry DeBlasey down in the assessor's department. So she manages all the workflow through that department. The Board of Assessors, as you see to the side there, it's a requirement to have a Board of Assessors as a municipality in the state, and they handle effectively a lot of the kind of higher level sign-off things, working with DLS to get tax certification, but they are in many ways a support to the ongoing operations within that department. And so in order to support this revised structure, we had to shift some costs around in the budget. And so you see the department head gets zeroed out as Mr. Karen resigned. That position has effectively been removed. Mr. Karen, who was formerly one of the 3 Board of Assessors, has assumed the role of chief assessor. And so you see in the part-time line that there are now 3 assessors being paid, 3 Board of Assessors being paid out of the part-time line, whereas last year there were only 2 because Mr. Karen was funded out of the department head line. So him pulling down into the part-time line allows him to receive the board stipend as well as some pockets of money so he can aid on an hourly basis some of the more complicated reports that are needed for some valuations of certain types of property and interacting with the appellate tax board and attorneys and things of that nature that are typically beyond the scope of what a Board of Assessor might take or might be responsible for. Additionally, to answer your other part of the question, there is funding for the revaluation. And I believe, Mr. Sweeney, you had a question similar to this that you had forwarded to me. So hopefully this addresses that as well, Mr. Sweeney. Once every 10 years, the city's required to do a full measure and list. So every year, the city looks at sales and looks at all the properties in its city limits and reassesses the values. If you look at your property tax bill from one year to the next, you'll notice that there's been adjustments to the land value and there's adjustments to the building value. And that's effectively based on sales comps and other methods that the assessors use to properly assess the property. Every 10 years, we're required to go and review every single parcel in the city and measure it, make sure we've captured everything, and that then gets submitted to the Division of Local Services. It's a requirement by statute, I believe it's statute, that the Division of Local Services reviews that and signs off on it. That's just to make sure that there's no wide variations in the assessor's methods of valuation when compared to a more thorough review of the valuation. But it's good that you both noticed this because it's a significant investment that the city needs to make, and it takes over the course of, in our case, it's going to take over the span 3 fiscal years. It started in FY23. We'll be fully going through FY24, and they'll probably wrap it up, I would say, in the beginning part of FY25, because that is the date by which we have to have the full measure and list submitted to DLS and certified. Is that helpful?
It was very helpful. Thank you.
Counselor Sweeney, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. I do have a few, and Counselor St. Hilaire asked a handful of them, and I appreciate you, Bryant, addressing those. Just so I understand with the assessing department and kind of what the day-to-day structure within City Hall looks like, Ms. DeBlacy is essentially the functional administrator for that department and has some staff, and that's why, while Mr. Karen still works in his capacity as an assessor on the Board of Assessors for the city, in terms of
Mr. Golden.
What's that?
Mr. Golden, I think you're referring to. Mr. Karen resigned.
And then, okay, so to understand that correctly, and then Mr. Golden is one of 3 assessors
Correct.
paid out of that Board of Assessors line, where they might not be actively working in City Hall every day, but
Correct.
fulfilling the function of the Board of Assessors. And then your more traditional department head, in this case, would be the work that Ms. DeBlazy is doing as the
Exactly,
assistant.
exactly. The assessors are typically in once every week, once every 2 weeks for a few hours to work through some paperwork, depending upon the time of the year.
Okay. All right, that's what I figured. Thank you for clarifying that. And that answers my question on, in the assessing department. I do have a question with regards to one of the lines in the accounting department. I noticed that there's a $23,000 expense for consulting. And initially, I assumed that that would have been for the annual audit, but in reviewing the clerk of committee's budget, I saw that there's $50,000 there for the annual audit. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what this $23,000 expense is.
Sure. It does fluctuate a little bit from year to year. You can see, if you look back at historical data on this particular line, I believe it's down the bottom, up just a hair. Yep, under purchase of service there, you can see, yeah, correct, the $23,000. That's down from $30,000 in this year. And you can see we spent roughly $28,000 and $34,000 in the previous 2 years. So it tends to hover around the $30,000. What that covers is there's a component of the audit that is covered by the accounting department, and that's specifically the CAFA report development, or the ACFR as it's called now, which is our comprehensive annual financial report. So even though $50,000 of the audit is covered under the clerk's department budget, the full engagement for the audit firm Powers & Sullivan is roughly $65,000. $50,000 to the clerks, $5,000 to accounting, $5,000 to the retirement board, and $5,000 to the schools. And in addition to that, there are some very specific engagements with other accounting firms. We have some engagements with a firm called Clifton Allen and Larson that help us perform our Schedule A and our balance sheet work, as well as fixed asset reporting at the end of the year, and those are roughly a few $1,000s each per engagement. The goal and the hope always has been with Mr. Chiani coming aboard that some of those functions begin to peel onto his plate. It lines well with his area of expertise, and we think it's a really good fit for the city to be able to use his experience in that way. That is why you see a slight decrease here, because we know we're not going to use it as much. I will also note that last fiscal year 23, there were also some costs in that line for the independent salary surveys that was performed for the BMEA collective bargaining union. That's contained in this line as well. And then there's always, every once in a while, sometimes like, for example, I needed a forensic review of some Federal Labor and Standards Act calculations that we were doing. So we had a forensics expert come in and provide a little guidance on that and things like that.
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful to clarify. The last question I have is regarding revenues, and I appreciate that you took the time to pull the historic new growth data together, and I know you mentioned that that'll be available for the full council. I don't want to put you on the spot or force you into making a commitment or anything, but I think one thing that I hear, and I know probably all of the councilors have heard, is concerns about the proposal in front of us increasing 2.5% in the tax levy. And, you know, given all the, well, I have this so I can, given the personal financial concerns that folks are facing and that their residential valuations are also increasing, there's certainly a desire from folks I've heard to try to constrain the tax increase as much as possible. Now, I understand in Mr. Perry's outline there's some pressures that we can't control, like health insurance costs and otherwise, but I guess what I'm getting at is I agree with the approach that you've taken in calculating new growth fairly conservatively at 1.2 million or so. If we were to be in a situation where that number was closer to the roughly 1.6 million that's listed for FY23, do you think there's any chance that that would have a real impact come December when we're setting the tax rate in terms of allowing us to go up at a lower percentage than the 2.5% that's proposed currently? Or would it really require a much more substantial new growth number to impact the 2.5% proposal?
Yeah, I mean, it's you can see that 2.5% equates to $3 million. And, you know, to make any real impact that someone really notices in their tax bill, it would need to be million, over $1 million. I would, in my experience. But I also would say that, you know, when we're talking about a 2.5% tax growth and we talk about Proposition 2.5, I just want to explain to maybe those at home that maybe don't fully understand or haven't had an opportunity to hear how that works. There's two components to the Proposition 2.5 limits. The first is that you cannot go up more than 2.5% of the levy limit, which we are under, okay? But you cannot go up more than 2.5 of the levy limit. The other component to Prop 2.5, and I'm looking to Mr. Perry because he probably helped write this legislation, but I believe it has to do with we cannot tax more than 2.5% of the equalized valuation of all our property in the city. I think it's something like that. We're far from that, so that's not even really a consideration for us. But up until 2 years ago, we historically would go up 2.5% above the levy limit and levy to the levy limit as close to it as we could get every year. The past 2 years have afforded us, collectively as policymakers, to provide some relief, and we're maintaining that relief. So it's, in year one, I believe we only went up 1.5% as opposed to the 2.5%. And then in year two, not only did we stay the 1.5% under the levy limit, but we also brought it down another, I believe it was about 0.25% or 0.3%. So when Mr. Perry was making comments about the excess levy capacity, that is tax relief that this body and the administration have given to property tax payers for consecutive years, every year. So you all should take, a bow for that. That's something we've strived to do. So when we put in our proposal that the tax rate is going up 2.5, That is an estimate of what we think we will need to cover this budget based on all the other estimated revenues we have. It just happens to coincide with what Proposition 2.5 limits as a percentage increase, because anything more than that might be too much of a burden for taxpayers, but anything less than that may not allow the city to continue to deliver the same level of services that it has delivered historically. So that's why we land at that rate this year.
Okay, thank you. I always appreciate the summaries.
Mr. Ailes, Mr. Perry, just a moment. For those who may be listening at home, I know it may be in the glossary, but could you, in layman's language, describe what the levy limit means? What is the levy limit?
The levy limit
As a concept.
is the maximum amount of taxes that the city can assess
Against what?
against all property owners in the city. That includes residential, commercial, industrial, and personal property.
Okay, so real estate and personal property. Okay, thank you. Mr. Perry, I believe you wanted to make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, to Councilor Sweeney's, I want to address that with your permission, of course. We're embarking upon some serious capital infrastructure expenditures. And as you, again, I repeat, I had about 6 criteria, if you will, or recommendations, suggestions that I think are important in order, if we're going to provide the services that the mayor is outlining tonight, and if you agree with that, and if you also want to do these high-end capital expenditures, the City Hall and the Cabot and even the McPherson Center, it's my advice to you as your budget analyst that I do not anticipate, nor would I recommend to the assessors, even if there's a large increase in new growth, that we not give the relief for the next couple of years. If you decide you don't want to redo City Hall, that's fine. Then I think we may have an opportunity to provide some property tax relief. But we have to refresh your memory, work very hard to bring in the revenues to enhance our balance sheet so we can use the balance sheet revenues to offset the debt, which will ultimately protect the taxpayers down the road and hopefully give us a beautiful building here, give us a new youth center, and obviously the whole Cabot Street thing. So again, I want to come back to my recommendation. I would not recommend to either the council or certainly the administration the next couple of years. I just do not anticipate relief from 2.5 if we're going to do this building. And I think it's important to be said. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry.
I also, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I feel this is an important topic, and I do want to just make the connection between this and property taxes and the other assumptions that are in the budget. Because here we stand and it's May, and we're building a budget for the next 13 months out. And there are a lot of assumptions built into other revenue areas. So as we stand here today, and Mr. Perry says it's a balanced budget, it's a responsible budget, I believe that to be true. But there are assumptions around overlay, there's assumptions around certain revenue streams that have come up since last year's budget, but we are facing an economy that we don't know what it's going to do. And if there were deterioration in some of those other areas that this budget relies on to be balanced between now and the time we set the tax rate and certify our new growth, it may be necessary to use some of that excess new growth that may exist at the time. It may not, but it may, to backfill some of the other revenue streams if they show signs of softening, so that we end the year in a responsible place. So it's a little too early to commit one way or the other. Right now, this is the landscape we are comfortable with and we think is a responsible approach, but we will revisit it again in November when we're before you all to talk about the shift and the levy and all of that when we set the tax rate in December.
Okay, thank you.
Quick question, Mr. Ailes. Is this chart on the website and available to the public for their, for them to view as the council is also viewing it, or can it get there if it's not there yet?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. This is, as we all know, the first year we've done this. There are, as we go through this process, we're going to realize that there's information that we're discussing that's relevant to decisions that we may next year want to begin to incorporate this. This is our first stab at this. It will only grow and get better and involve more information as time goes on. So yes, it's relevant. Yes, it is contained in the financial forecast document. Financial forecast document is not necessarily linked to this, but it is on our website in one place. It's just not.
Refresh my memory, the financial forecast is included in the digital budget book?
It is not,
It
but
is
it
not.
is on the website in the financial reporting area.
Okay, so it can be found, it is there,
It
just
can be
not in
found.
this digital
It's-
book?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
There will be improvements we make as time
Sure.
goes on.
Sure, sure,
with this.
thank you. Councilor Rotundo, I believe you wanted to.
Mr. Ailes, I just have one question in regards to the IT. I know it was discussed under the CARES Act, ARPA money in regards to upgrading for the remote meetings. I know right now it may be a moot point because we're going to be moving out of the building and what have you, but just at least could we have an update of where it's at? If you even have an update, or should we hold that for Mr. Collins when he comes in front of us? Because I know, from what I understand, he took over the project going forward.
Yeah, it's a great question, Counselor. I'm going to make myself a little note here and talk with IT in the morning, and Mr. Collins. It may be appropriate, depending upon who's driving what components of it, and we can get you an update.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other councilors with questions for Mr. Ailes? Councilor St. Hilaire?
I guess just to follow up on Mr. Sweeney's question on the 2.5%, you seem to be making the connection that if we do City Hall, we shouldn't, we should go to 2.5, but if we were not to go to, what is that, why is that a link directly?
Well, as you look at the capital expenditure plan that lays out future debt obligations, there is a correlation between increasing revenues, regardless of where they come from, and an increase in the budget for debt service that is required to pay for the bills of this building. It's as if you buy a new home and it might be tight at first and you're looking to the future. You need to make sure that your revenues, your personal income continues to grow at a level that you can afford that mortgage going forward. So we're effectively trying to look to the future and making sure we're not cutting the legs out from under us by either not collecting revenue that is needed to run services and pay debt service, or, well, yeah, that's kind of the point of it.
Go ahead.
So, I guess we did authorize some money for the study of a renovated City Hall, but I don't know that we've committed to anything at this point, or a timeline, or, a magnitude of what that renovation would look like. So, to me, I have a hard time saying to taxpayers that we need to raise your taxes by the most we possibly can because of some projected future City Hall project that we haven't really even defined fully what it's going to look like. I know there's been proposals and discussions, but to me, if that's the only thing holding us back from doing something on the tax levy, then I would consider that's something we should talk about.
If I may just follow up on that, having said that, as you stated earlier, we already are not taxing to the full levy limit. We have that
1.3 to 1.4 excess levy, yeah.
Yeah, so there is tax relief on an ongoing basis, even when we are going to the levy limits now of 2.5 under this proposed budget, correct?
We are not going to the levy limit under this proposal.
You're going to 2.5% under this.
We're proposing a 2.5% increase, which remains about 1.5% under the levy limit.
Correct. Perhaps I did not articulate well enough, but that is my point. Even though we're going up 2.5% on this proposed budget, there still is excess levy limit, which is effectively a tax relief to the taxpayer on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
Correct? Okay, thank you. I thought I saw someone else. Any other questions for Mr. Ailes? Yes, Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. I just had another quick follow-up on the new growth projections, and we'll just add my +1 to Councilor Rotundo's question. I know it's something we've been asking about for quite a while now. And last I heard, there was a part on order, so it seems like it's already been budgeted for, to be able to turn this chamber into a room that could hold hybrid meetings effectively. So appreciate you following up on that one. But on the new growth side, just wanted to hear a little bit about the trend we're expecting. I know those, as you were saying, those numbers are sort of constantly evolving. The one that's in the budget, I think, is a little bit higher than the financial forecast, which means maybe, things are looking better than 6 months ago. When we were talking about the project on Cabot Street, we did talk about how that would reduce new growth in future years, with a development plan now not happening. And then, eventually maybe comes back online. So if you can just share what some of the factors are in that as of today, knowing that they will keep changing.
Sure. Well, you made reference to the financial forecast, which is a useful tool. It's done well in advance of budgets being passed, and in an effort to try to keep the train on the rails and not go off the rail, we make very reasonable assumptions around things, tend to be careful assumptions as to not overcommit the city too far in advance. But as we get closer to reality, which is starting next month, we're going to be in this budget cycle, we have more data to better inform the information. And so we know, based on what's going on around town and the building permits that are getting pulled, that we're still comfortable projecting new growth up over $1 million. If you look at the history I provided, you can see that it does fluctuate. I don't know how many years I gave you there, but back, there have been years that have come in under $1 million. You can also note the fluctuation between the different classes of new growth, and that's relevant as well, because you can see that there tends to be a fairly large amount of the new growth contained within the personal property section of our classification. And that's relevant because in good times, when cost of capital is cheap, i.e. interest rates are low, companies are investing in capital expenditures, i.e. utility companies, cable companies. These are all companies that we capture their investments as new growth in the personal property sector of this calculation. And so as the cost of capital grows, the amount of investment tends to kind of work inversely to that, because it's too expensive in some cases to make the warranted investments, or they're trying to maintain cash levels because the uncertainty in the economy. So there can be some fluctuation in that particular line, and you can see that in any given year, it could be as much as 40 or 50% of the overall growth. What we are seeing, though, is we're seeing continued permits at the personal resident level, right? People are still putting on decks. People are still pulling permits to replace their windows and doing kind of the regular maintenance that's going on. Whether or not that begins to tighten due to interest rates and cost of capital and potential equity line costs and things like that, we have yet to see. But that will play out in the coming year more likely than the past year, because we are able to look at the volume of our building permits, and that is kind of data point one that informs where we think we're headed with new growth, because you're kind of operating a year in arrears when you certify your new growth, right? We're going to certify it through the fall, I believe, through the fall, and get a certification in October, but that's all for new growth that has already occurred. And so we're fairly confident given the amount of permits, as well as some of the progress that's been made on some of the larger developments that you see around town. We're able to capture that as they approach completion. We capture as they go. So there'll be some bit of revenue associated with those as well.
Okay. Other questions for Mr. Ailes regarding the Finance Department? Seeing none, Mr. Ailes, Mr. Chiani, thank you very much for your help this evening, and Mr. Perry as well. Thank you for your assistance. Looking forward to seeing all three of you this coming Thursday June 1st, as well as next week. We'll be meeting also on Tuesday and Thursday, Tuesday, June 6th, and Thursday, June 8th, to continue these discussions. And as always, for the superlative coverage from BevCam and Kim in the operator's booth, thank you very much for your help. I would entertain a motion to adjourn committee of the whole.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Aye, motion carries. And a motion to adjourn finance and property.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, we are adjourned.